Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about the Lake District. So before we get into this week's topic, we have a bit of business, and it just so happens to be appropriately Pride and Prejudice themed, so very exciting.
We love a good theme. Mm-hmm.
We are coming up on our 3-year anniversary. Yay!
Woohoo!
Oh, how time flies. And to celebrate, we're teaming up with Well Read Company, maker of those beautiful literary themed purses and bags that you've probably seen around. And they are graciously sponsoring a giveaway with us. And the winner will receive their Pride and Prejudice crossbody bag, which is designed to look like the famous Peacock edition, which just seems like the kind of thing our listeners would be into. So if you are interested in joining this celebratory giveaway, we'll be posting about that on Instagram in a couple of days. So make sure you're following us on there if you would like to enter. And thank you to Well Read Company for helping us to celebrate this 3-year anniversary.
Party!
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now back to the episode and this week's topic of the Lake District. This mention occurs roughly a third of the way through Pride and Prejudice. At this point in the novel, Jane Bennet is in London staying with her Aunt and Uncle Gardiner, and Lizzy is traveling to Hunsford with Sir William and Maria Lucas to visit Charlotte. Lizzy was, initially like, I really don't want to go. And then she's like, okay, I guess this will be okay. It's been long enough since I've seen Collins. I think I can handle this.
She's built up some tolerance. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. On the way to Hunsford, they stay over in London, and Mrs. Gardiner invites Lizzy to accompany them on a summer trip.
So here is what we get from the text. "We have not quite determined how far it shall carry us," said Mrs. Gardiner, "but perhaps to the lakes." No scheme could have been more agreeable to Elizabeth, and her acceptance of the invitation was most ready and grateful. "My dear, dear aunt," she rapturously cried, "what delight, what felicity! You give me fresh life and vigor. Adieu to disappointment and spleen. What are men to rocks and mountains?" So it's a deep philosophical question we all have to ask ourselves.
So what are these lakes that Mrs. Gardiner is speaking of, and that Lizzy is so excited to go visit? The Lakes, or the Lake District, is a region and national park in Cumbria in northwest England. It is famous for its landscape, including its glacial lakes, coast, and the Cumbrian Mountains, or fells, that were shaped through multiple glaciations in the Ice Age.
According to the Lake District National Park, the area's volcanic rock does not allow water to seep away, and that, combined with the region's high rainfall and deep glacial valleys, means that these valleys and lakes can store large volumes of water. And so the Lake District has over 14 lakes and tarns, which is obviously where the region gets its name.
Beautiful vistas wherever you look. So the Lake District was considered a somewhat wild and desolate place until the last half of the 18th century. It was perceived as rather deeply bucolic and relatively untouched by industrialization and human influence. A time and place apart, essentially.
Yes. But the publication of A Guide to the Lakes by Thomas West in 1778 marked a turning point in this perception. West's guide promoted the beauty and splendor of the Lake District, and it essentially marks the beginning of Lake District tourism.
Another massively influential figure in the rise of the popularity of the lakes was William Gilpin. Gilpin is generally credited with establishing the picturesque movement in Great Britain, and we've mentioned him before in episodes including Marianne's Dead Leaves and Box Hill. Gilpin is one of those figures that he pops up a lot.
He's kind of everywhere, absolutely. So the picturesque, according to Gilpin, is, quote, "that peculiar kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture." So, it is what it says it is. It's what the label says.
This is nice to look at. It is picturesque.
This is what reminds me of my picture books. So he took his ideas from landscape paintings and really just wanted to pursue and identify the ideals of the picturesque in actual physical landscapes, just kind of saying, let's compare the two. what are the ideals that make this the prettiest.
He toured extensively in Great Britain and published books that detailed these travel routes, identifying sites and locations that particularly suited his ideals of the picturesque. He had opinions. In 1786, he published Observations relative chiefly to picturesque beauty, made in the year 1772, on several parts of England, particularly the mountains and lakes of Cumberland and Westmoreland. And that is all one title.
Of course it is.
Yes. This work described the lakes in a hugely favorable way that made the British public wild to travel to the district to experience this picturesque paradise for themselves. We have to go. Gilpin says it's amazing.
It's so true. And one of the best ways to really get a sense of Gilpin's theories and perceptions of the picturesque is to read from his works. So this is a bit long, but you'll notice the way that he critiques things in the landscape that don't fit the ideals that he has versus his highfalutin praise for the things that really do. So this passage comes from his observations of the Lake District, and he's describing a view that would likely be somewhere around Surprise View in the Lake District today. So he can see Derwent Water, he can also see Bassenthwaite Water, and Skiddaw, which is the fell next to the village of Keswick. But Gilpin, he has some opinions about Skiddaw. So this is from his text. We had heard too much of this mountain to meet it properly. It had none of those bold projections and of that shaggy majesty about it, which we expected to have seen in this king of mountains. It is a tame, inanimate object. He's just deeply disappointed. It's not raw enough for me.
This poor mountain, just doing its best, and it's not good enough. So he then goes on to describe the rest of the scene, which he feels is particularly picturesque. But if the mountain disappointed us, the scene over which it presided went beyond our imagination. This rich, extensive view was aided when we saw it by all the powers, or more properly, the resplendency of light and shade. The morning had been fine, but in the afternoon, the clouds began to gather threatening rain. Just as we arrived at the brow of the hill with the scenery of the two lakes and their accompaniments before us, the setting sun burst forth in a glow of splendor. So, things are turning around.
He's like, wait, something is happening.
And then he continues, if a common sunset often gives a beautiful appearance even to an ordinary landscape, what must have been the effect of an uncommon one on such a landscape as this? The effect was astonishing. Every part glowed with transcendent luster, but it was a transitory vision. While we gazed, it faded, and in a few moments nothing was left but the great outlines, the grand composition of the scene. We should have stood over it even thus in rapture, if we had not just seen what a splendid addition it was capable of receiving. Okay, I want to go.
He's like, can you imagine this sunset? He's really trying to sell not just the view, but this experience, right? And you can understand why people would read this and then be like, book my tickets. I want to go to the lakes.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, you're like, okay, I want to see a transitory vision. Come on.
Sign me up.
There are also elements of the sublime in this description. The sublime was integral to the Romantic era, which kind of overlapped with the picturesque and then superseded it. The sublime was an experience of awe, terror, or danger in nature that stirred strong, generative sensations in its beholders. It's awe-inspiring. You can't even believe what you're seeing.
Yes. So in Gilpin's scene, we get elements of the picturesque where he's talking about light and shading and distance and foreground. We're getting the references to composition. We get what he's doing with landscape painting references. But we do also get the elements of awe with elements of danger with the threat of an oncoming storm. And then it brings on, he uses the words transcendence, visions, and rapture. So he's really leaning into both the picturesque, but also the way it generates these sensations.
The nature is beautiful, but it's almost so beautiful that it's a little bit scary,
This is scary beautiful, and that's a good thing. And that's a good thing.
The lake poets were also deeply invested in the sublime in their descriptions of the lakes as well. Southey, Coleridge, and especially William Wordsworth were considered connected with the Romantic movement's look to nature and the sublime for inspiration. Their poetry was so clearly based in the Lake District's potential for the sublime that it essentially became copy for the Lake District Tourism Board, and kind of still is, honestly.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. Anytime that you look up the Lake District, you're going to find snippets from Wordsworth. Like, it just is, yeah. And Wordsworth's poetry wasn't the only thing that encouraged tourism to the lakes. In 1810, he was hard up for cash, living the poet life, and he anonymously published what came to be known as his Guide to the Lakes. It was an essay that accompanied a collection of 48 sketches of the Lake District landscapes by the Reverend Joseph Wilkinson.
So he continued to rework that essay for the next several decades, and it evolved into a bit of an address to tourists on how to responsibly enjoy the lakes. So due to influential texts like those written by Thomas West, William Gilpin, and the Lake Poets, the lakes became a really popular tourist destination in the late Georgian era. This place is blowing up. Everyone wants to go there.
Yeah. And it's not just these authors that are having an impact. We do need to mention a few other factors that contributed to the area's popularity. Fewer people in England were doing the grand tour on the continent because of all the unrest and war. So people were turning to Great Britain, doing their tourist more locally, doing tourism at home.
In a similar vein, there were infrastructure and travel technology changes during this era. The roads and travel routes are more established, and travel coaches themselves were more comfortable. So people were willing to try out locations like the lakes that had been relatively under the radar or inaccessible before now.
And there was a relatively new bustling industry for travel guides, travel logs, portable atlases, and the like. According to Hazel Jones in Jane Austen's Journeys, quote, "From the 1780s on, as the road network spread and domestic tourism became increasingly popular, the whole genre of travel literature, for both serious and armchair travelers, expanded and flourished. Before setting out for popular tourist destinations, those with inquiring minds scoured the circulating libraries, consulted their own collections of geographical texts, and purchased the most up-to-date information on locations and routes."
There were even geographical board games and puzzles that promoted tourism. As Jane Dove explains in her article, Geographical Board Game, Promoting Tourism and Travel in Georgian England and Wales. And you can also see our episode on the Bertram Sisters puzzle for more on that. Lots of callbacks in this episode.
Yeah, it's all very interconnected. The discerning traveler would also prepare for their tour with a travel journal or sketchbooks, a Claude glass. Again, we talk about that in our episode on Box Hill. And this would all be so that they could view the landscapes of the lake with the maximum picturesque potential. This is important. According to Jones, travelers equipped themselves with William Gilpin's picturesque tours, packed their watercolor boxes and sketch pads, their pencils and notebooks, and set off to discover and record an England that could be framed and displayed on the drawing room wall. Did the tour even happen if you don't have a picture?
Yeah, exactly. You need to have proof.
That's the question.
Travelers would also pack their poetry books, as one does, in addition to the guides, so that they could really have the full poetic or sublime experience as laid out by Wordsworth or Cooper or Keats. You got to get up there. You need to whip out your book of poetry. You need to read dramatically out loud. That's all part of the experience.
Yeah. Literary tourism. Nothing new, friends. Nothing new. But this wasn't all about the aesthetics, and it wasn't all about the sublime. We do have to talk about some of the practicalities, right? So travelers who wanted to experience the lakes would have to be willing to do some serious walking. For context, Dorothy Wordsworth, when she was about 46, wrote that she would walk 16 miles in 4 hours and 3/4. And that's kind of a pretty bristling pace, actually, for these mountain slopes
uphill
that she's on. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's estimated that she and her brother would walk something like an average of 10 miles a day. Like that's just their usual.
Austen, who once described herself and Martha Lloyd as desperate walkers, might not have been completing these kinds of daily hikes up the fells of the Lake District. It's not quite the same. But Jones writes that, quote, "The miles tramped by James Plumtree during his tours round England, Scotland, and Wales between 1790 and 1800 more than earned him the epithet of desperate walker."
I love that he gets the epithet, though, right? I mean, like the fact that Should he get a trophy that says Desperate
Yes.
Walker
Yeah.
Award?
I would want one.
I think it's important.
Yes, I mean, I want that on a shirt. He walked from Cambridgeshire to North Wales in 1792, through the Peak District in 1793, through Scotland, the Lake District, and Derbyshire in 1796, across the West Riding of Yorkshire to the Lakes and North Wales in 1797, to the northeast coast of England, into Scotland, the Lake District, and North Wales in 1799. So,
wow.
My man James Plumtree, indeed a desperate walker.
Yes, earning that title like a champion.
Mm-hmm.
So, while you might not have to be that desperate of a walker to, pursue the picturesque, you do have to be willing to put in some miles. And I think, that practicality matters.
So now it's time to turn our attention back to Austen and how this excitement about the picturesque and touring the lakes is reflected in her own experiences and in Pride and Prejudice. We know that Austen enjoyed Gilpin's works and that they influenced her own writing.
According to Maggie Lane, in Jane Austen's England, in the summer of 1791, Austen's brother, Edward, traveled with the Knight family to tour the lakes. This is only a few years after Gilpin's Guide was published, and so it's kind of, he's cutting edge tourism right here. And Lane points out that, quote, Jane had the opportunity to hear Edward's impressions when she was with him in 1794 and 1796. And she took up the idea of a northern tour in Pride and Prejudice, which belongs to this period.
Several critics have speculated that early drafts of Pride and Prejudice likely included even more overt connections to Gilpin, but by the time that the novel was published, Austen might have edited out some of the more overt connections, in part because Gilpin's version of the picturesque had started to be just a little bit out of fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's on its way out. And one of the biggest indicators of Gilpin's fading popularity was the 1812 publication of William Combes' comical poem, The Tour of Dr. Syntax in Search of the Picturesque. So Dr. Syntax is considered a parody of Gilpin, and throughout the poem, he's riding his ridiculous horse named Grizzle, and they're riding around the countryside trying to find the picturesque, and every time he's trying to enjoy a view, Dr. Syntax is thwarted by something or other. Sometimes Grizzle gets in the way, sometimes he gets, chased by highwaymen, you never know. And the poem was also accompanied by a series of illustrations by Thomas Rowlandson, and that just really pushes this comic narrative over the top.
Francesca Oristano, in her article, The Reverend William Gilpin and the Picturesque, or Who's Afraid of Dr. Syntax, points out that Dr. Syntax, and by association Gilpin, was dubbed the Don Quixote of the Lake District. And that pretty much says everything about the parody and the decline in the popularity of the picturesque during this period. It's hard not to make that connection. He's riding around on Grizzle.
Yes.
He keeps getting thwarted. I mean, yeah, it's right there.
But also, once you get that description, you're like, got it. That's what we're doing here. Don Quixote of the Lake District. So Dr. Syntax it actually became something of a cultural phenomenon. So it would have been hard not to know about it at this time. And Austen specifically mentions Dr. Syntax in a letter dated March 2nd, 1814. And while that is after the publication of Pride and Prejudice, it stands to reason that Austen was already familiar with Dr. Syntax and that echoes of this satirical depiction can be found in the ways that Gilpin shows up in Pride and Prejudice.
For example, when Elizabeth stays at Netherfield while Jane is recovering, she and Mrs. Hurst run into Darcy and Miss Bingley as they walk outside. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley immediately take Darcy's arms and try to exclude Lizzy. Darcy understands that this is rude and says, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go into the avenue."
And then we get this absolutely delightful line from Lizzy. She says, No, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoiled by admitting a fourth. Goodbye."
And then she runs away.
she's laughing when she says that. That's actually in like the way that Austen describes it. She's kind of just like, no, I'm good. You do your thing.
So you've probably picked up on her use of the word picturesque here and the allusion to Gilpin. But this is a Gilpin deep cut for all of our Gilpin fans out there.
The Gilpin stands will have already spotted where we're going.
Mm-hmm. What's absolutely hilarious about this line is that, according to Fiona Stafford in the Oxford World's Classics edition of Pride and Prejudice, quote, Elizabeth seems to have in mind William Gilpin's advice on the proper arrangement of cattle in a picturesque landscape.
Yes, cattle. So, according to Gilpin, in his observations of the Lake District, he points out that, quote, cattle are so large that when they ornament a foreground, a few are sufficient. 2 cows will hardly combine. 3 make a good group, either united or when one is a little removed from the other 2. If you increase the group beyond 3, 1 or more in proportion must necessarily be a little detached. This detachment prevents heaviness and adds variety. So, 3 is the ideal cow configuration.
So yeah, Lizzy calls Miss Bingley a cow. And technically she says that about the whole group, but it seems likely that it's mostly aimed at Miss Bingley and possibly Mrs. Hurst in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And according to David Shepard in his annotations to the novel, quote, it is possible that Darcy, as a reader, might catch Elizabeth's allusion to Gilpin. It is doubtful that Miss Bingley or Mrs. Hurst would.
Which is why it's so funny the way that she's laughing when she says this. She's like, no, you guys are good. Bye. Because she's just called them cattle. And I think that is just, Austen, you gem. You absolute gem. Now, let's look a bit closer at the scene we referenced at the top of the episode and that whole planned trip to the lakes. So Elizabeth is excited about the trip, obviously, and it leads to some really fantastic over-the-top declarations from her, who needs men? We've got mountains. But for context, remember that this idea is presented to us after she's learned about Bingley's desertion of Jane and Wickham's defection to Miss King. So Dennis Allen, in the article No Love for Lydia, The Fate of Desire in Pride and Prejudice, points out that these events, quote, have made her cynical about men. She views the trip as a substitute. So yeah, it makes sense when she says, what are men to rocks and mountains? She's like, I'm kind of a bit jaded right now. No, thank you.
So it's extremely fitting that this isn't just a Gilpin-esque moment, but a moment where she's ready to go to the mountains and commune with the sublime and picturesque rather than deal with humans. I mean, we've all been there. So the lakes, especially the way they are depicted in the accounts we've mentioned, are described as away from humans. It's ideal for solitary walking and reflection and all of that. It's just like, do not talk to me. I'm done peopling right now.
Mm-hmm. I am communing with terror and awe in nature. So Lizzy goes on to talk specifically about tourists in the Lake District. And she says, oh, what hours of transport we shall spend. And when we do return, it shall not be like other travelers, without being able to give one accurate idea of anything. We will know where we have gone. We will recollect what we have seen. Lakes, mountains, and rivers shall not be jumbled together in our imaginations. Nor, when we attempt to describe any particular scene, will we be quarreling about its relative situation. Let our first effusions be less insupportable than those of the generality of travelers. She's like, we're going to do this right.
So this passage is one that leads scholars to think that early drafts of Pride and Prejudice would have had more riffs on Gilpin and the picturesque, because this moment is very similar to a scene in one of her earlier writings, Kitty or the Bower, also known as Catherine or the Bower. According to Lane, quote, Jane Austen had already had some fun at the expense of this movement in Catherine, the fragment written when she was just 16. The foolish Camilla Stanley gushes. We are going to the lakes this autumn, and I am quite mad with joy. I assure you, I have done nothing for this last month but plan what clothes I should take with me, and I have at last determined to take very few indeed, besides my traveling dress, and so I advise you to do, whenever you go, for I intend, in case we should fall in with any races, or stop at Matlock or Scarborough, to have some things made for the occasion.
So just in case you're not familiar with the geography that Camilla is referencing here, Matlock and Scarborough are on opposite sides of the country, making this a particularly delightful dig at Camilla, who has no clue about the actual route of the tour she's going on.
It's like when all those AI-generated travel guides started showing up on Amazon, and people were looking them up and seeing that a bunch of the routes made no sense.
Ping-ponging across the landscape.
Yeah. And in Pride and Prejudice, we have what seems like a response to Camilla from Elizabeth when she tells her aunt, we will know where we have gone. We will recollect what we have seen. Lakes, mountains, and rivers shall not be jumbled together.
I love that she's actually like riffing on her own writing as a teenager. I think, again, Jane Austen's genius. We love her. So other scholars have pointed out that Lizzy's outburst here is likely also a reaction to the frenetic tourist trope that is kind of just more generally available. For example, as Lane writes, in his Traveler's Oracle, Dr. Kitchener recommended tourists to keep memorandums in pocket notebooks to remind them of village names and sites of interest visited on their journeys. Without keeping a record, he said, only a vague recollection would exist of the places passed through en route. You can't possibly keep this straight unless you're keeping your travelogue.
Although as somebody who has a horrible memory for like names and things, I'm like, well,
he's not wrong.
Yeah. I need to write these things down. In another account, according to Lane, Joseph Budworth reported that, quote, visitors in search of quick thrills dashed past the recommended viewing points in their picturesque guides with an exclamation of, oh, how fine, and etc. Or, the day after we were upon Windermere, good God, how delightful, how charming, I could live here forever. Row on, row on, row on.
This is incredible. I could stay here all day. Let's keep going. We've got a schedule,
Yeah, we have places to see.
And I think this is just really telling that this kind of frenetic tourist motif, it's perennial, right? We've all been there, or we've seen the tourists who are just invested in, crossing sites off their list. It's a perennial trope. And at the same time, though, obviously, like, as long as you're not doing harm, do tourism however you want. Like,
yeah,
whatever makes you happy is the right way to do it. So I just love that there's like this range of tourism that we're getting here.
Yeah, and how one side does seem particularly judgy of the other side.
Yes.
Ultimately, this is the trip to the lakes that never happens. Spoiler alert.
We've built you up all this way to say, wah, wah.
In case you've been listening and thinking, wait, do they go to the lakes? Did I miss that?
No, they did not go.
It does not happen. So Lizzy gets a letter from her aunt in which we learn that Mr. Gardiner would be prevented by business from setting out till a fortnight later in July and must be in London again within a month. And as that left too short a period for them to go so far and see so much as they had proposed, or at least to see it with the leisure and comfort they had built on, they were obliged to give up the lakes.
So even though Lizzy is understandably sad to lose a chance to see the lakes, especially, since there is this cultural buildup around the area that we've been discussing, but at the same time, she realizes there's very real logistical reasons why this wouldn't work, since he's got to be back in town. So Shapard points out, quote, Hertfordshire is more than 200 miles from the Lake District. Actual road distance would be even greater. Under prevailing travel conditions, the journey would take several days each way. The mountainous and underdeveloped character of the area would also make going from site to site slow, further lengthening the trip. The county of Derbyshire's rugged scenery made it perhaps the most popular tourist destination in England after the lakes. It lies only half as far from Hertfordshire as the lakes and is a more settled area, so a trip there would take considerably less time. Like, what do you want to have happen? Do you want us to enjoy communing, or do you want us to go the distance? And it makes a lot of logistical sense for them to just choose an equally scenic but closer destination.
And, Mrs. Gardiner has that personal connection,
right?
So there's that as well. So the last mention of the lakes occurs at the end of the novel when Lizzy writes to her aunt to inform her of her engagement to Mr. Darcy. And she writes, I thank you again and again for not going to the lakes. How could I be so silly as to wish it?
Oh, I love that.
It's like she's tacitly giving her aunt and uncle credit for Darcy and Lizzie's happy ending, which is fair.
You know that the Gardiners were like watching all of their interactions. Uh-huh. Like they feel like they were part of this.
Mm-hmm.
This, I mean,
as they should.
Totally.
It's like, oh, we should go visit Pemberley. Lizzy, we shouldn't. No, we should. No, we promise. No one's there. The family's away from home. It's gonna be fine. Okay. Oh, surprise! It's Mr. Darcy walking around the corner.
Isn't this just remarkable that he's here? Yeah.
It's weird running into this man at his own house. Just so strange how that happened.
Coincidentally, he's at his home. But yeah, I love the Gardiners and the way that they are just, Mrs. Gardiner has watched all of their interactions, and she's like, I mean, because that's the whole reason that Lizzie's writing the letter in the first place. She's like, okay,
Yes.
Your last letter, you assumed we were engaged, and I was just not in a mood to write to you because I was not. But now, thanks for not going to the lakes. Everything's great.
Yep. Come for Christmas. I love you. You're my favorites.
Yeah. And the way that she writes this letter is so indicative of that effervescence of her personality and that she's just practically bursting with happiness at her engagement. I mean, this is Lizzy at her playful best. I'm so glad we didn't go to the lakes,
Yeah.
That's great.
How could I have been so silly as to even wish to go to the lakes? Obviously, Derbyshire was the correct choice. Like, that is what we were supposed to do.
Peak District is actually the best tourist site.
Way better. So moving on from Pride and Prejudice to where else we see the Lake District popping up. We actually get a mention in Mansfield Park when the narrator describes Fanny's East Room and the various objects that have been used to decorate the space, including, quote, 3 transparencies made in a rage for transparencies for the 3 lower panes of one window, where Tintern Abbey held its station between a cave in Italy and a moonlit lake in Cumberland. So Fanny has some Lake District artwork in her room.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lake District, I mean, it just is intrinsically connected to literature of this era and beyond. Like, it's just, it's kind of an omnipresent thing. It's not just the literature, it's music, it's pop culture, right? You can't cover all of the famous examples.
We just cannot give them all to you.
Right. I mean, yes, we do know that Taylor Swift has a song, about the lakes. I'm very cool because I know this.
Yes. We are hip and cool. Thank you very much. Okay.
But, the one thing that I do, one person I do feel like we need to mention is that Beatrix Potter is a writer also strongly associated with the Lake District. So if you go to Lake District, you can go to Dove Cottage and Rydalmount, which are where Wordsworth lived. You can kind of go to Keswick and see Coleridge's, but you also can go and see the farm that Beatrix Potter wrote her famous children's books. And it's idyllic. It's beautiful. We all want to go to the lakes now, basically.
Yeah, I went to go to Beatrix Potter's farm and think about cute little animals.
Yeah,
so
watch the Jemima puddle ducks cross your path. Like, this is important.
Exactly. Yes. Well, if you have any thoughts about the Lake District or stories of your own visits to the area, we definitely want to hear them, and please send photos.
Obviously. Or your landscape paintings.
Yes, we will take either. You can connect with us on Instagram at The Thing About Austen and on Twitter at Austen_things. You can also contact us via our website, thethingaboutaustin.com, or you can email us at thethingaboutaustin@gmail.com. And you can find our merch for the podcast on Redbubble at aboutaustin.redbubble.com. And we have a bit of listener mail this week.
Yay!
This email comes to us from listener Tiffany, who wrote in after the episode on Henry Crawford reading Shakespeare. A little over a year ago for Feb Regency,
that's adorable,
my daughter and neighbor and I started reading out loud to each other. We started with Sense and Sensibility and have moved through Northanger Abbey and now Pride and Prejudice. So they have a read aloud club, which
is fantastic.
Is so charming. And then Tiffany also included this story. We're reading Sense and Sensibility. We get to the part where Eleanor finds out Lucy Steele married Robert Ferrars, and both Evelyn, my daughter, and Alta, my neighbor, just shouted, "What?" They had no idea.
Plot twist.
I just love that idea of like they're doing a group read aloud, and a couple of the people have never read the book before. They're just like in unison, "What?"
And this is why communal reading is fabulous. I love this.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Stay tuned for next episode when we'll be talking about Mr. Knightley's strawberries.
Thanks for listening. Bye.